said, I'm used to teaching 12-year-olds, so this is brief, and I will do my best here. So here are my goals for you today. I'm sorry this is so small. So I want to explain how women's roles changed in the late 1800s. I want to discuss how women got the right to vote, and then I'll explain how reformers tried to improve the lives of working women. So that's kind of the goals for this little mini lecture today. So if we look at women's rights, it really comes to the forefront with the Seneca Falls Convention, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. And that happened in July of 1848, right here in New York State, in Seneca Falls, New York. And some of the leading advocates of the time, people like Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass were at this convention. And the goal was to make other people aware that women did not have the same rights as men, and they really started to demand that, hey, you know, we're ready here, we want the same rights. So they had a document that they called the Declaration of Sentiments. And that document was based on the Declaration of Independence. And when I teach this to kids, I put both documents up and we look at them word by word. And this was a very conscious decision by these women and men that we're going to use a document that people already know about, and we're going to phrase this in a way that people will look at it and say, oh, okay, here's what women are looking for, okay? So they used a document that people already knew. The women's rights movement actually grew out of the abolitionist movement. Okay, so women were fighting to free the slaves. And they would go to these meetings, and the males at the meetings would say to them, wow, you've got some really great ideas, but you can't vote. We're not going to let you vote at these meetings. So they felt like, well, if we have all these great ideas, why isn't anybody listening to us? Why do we have no voice? They realized, well, we don't have any rights either. So we're fighting to free the slaves. We don't have any rights either. We can't vote. We can't own property. We can't sit on a jury. So they realized that they didn't have rights either. So women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other women also were interested in working for married women's rights. So not only were they trying to free the slaves, they're trying to help married women, and that sort of morphed into, well, why don't we try to help all women? Because none of us have any rights. And at the time, the Civil War broke out, and abolitionists said to women, you know what, just wait a little while. If you just wait a little while, after we free the slaves, then we'll work on women's rights. And some women said, well, okay, you know, freeing slaves seems to be really, really important, so we want to do that. Other women said, I don't think so. I want rights too. This isn't fair. We should all have rights. So if we sort of flash forward to the late 1800s, early 1900s, we see that middle-class women are really going to become the leaders in this reform movement to give women more rights. So the reasons for that were that families were smaller than they were in the old days. Technology made housework a little easier, so you're not spending 12 hours a day doing housework. You've got a little bit of time to do something else. And I hate to say this, but they had things like vacuum cleaners, so you're not like dragging the rugs outside, rolling them, sticking them over the line, beating on them with a sweeper, you know, those old rug beaters. So it didn't take women quite as long. They were still doing a whole ton of housework, but not quite as long as they used to. More of these middle-class women were college educated. And they had role models, so people like Jane Addams and Mother Cabrini. So they looked at these other women who were going into the slums, who were helping immigrants, and they said, you know what, we want to do that too. We want to make a difference.
Who was Mother Cabrini? I don't know.
She was an Italian nun who actually went into the slums and actually worked with the poor.
So I know Jane Addams was in Chicago, Whole House. But
Mother Cabrini was in, I believe, New York City. She would actually go right into the slums and work with the poor.
Okay.
Sounds like a Mother Teresa.
Yeah, she kind of was. Yeah. So they were looking at this woman thinking, wow, I want to do that. You know, I don't know if I can go right into the slums, but I want to do that. I want to make a difference. So as I said before, many of these reformers start out as abolitionists. So people like Susan B. Anthony, I'm sure we've all heard of her. She's one of my heroes. And they wanted to actually go through the government and try to get that right to vote. So they organized the National Women's Suffrage Association. That's organized by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And they actually wanted a women's suffrage amendment added to the Constitution. Well, that didn't go over very well, as you can well imagine. And so another group formed in 1890, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And that's led by Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt. And I'm sure, I think I remember reading something in the newspaper that Carrie Chapman Catt actually came to Ogdensburg and Canton area. Susan B. Anthony was also here too. So some of these women actually, they traveled all over making speeches and trying to get more people on their side.
And Carrie Chapman Catt was the founder of the League of Women Voters.
Yes, yes, she was. She was. So what I find interesting is that women get the right to vote actually out west first. So if you look at the western states, Wyoming, they have the right to vote in parts of Wyoming way back in 1869. Okay, by 1890, all women could vote in Wyoming, but not in New York. And that's true of the other western states as well. So women are getting the right to vote in the west. The east, which is a more established society, they don't get that right. The reason for that is because women were working alongside of men on the frontier, and men really valued that and said, well, if she can work alongside me in the field, she can vote. And so women were able to actually get the rights that they wanted in the West a lot more quickly. Alice Paul was a leading suffragist who founded the National Woman's Party in 1916. She's a younger suffragist, and she's more radical than women before her. And this group's going to be a more radical group. She actually went to England and was studying in England and saw what suffragettes were doing in England with hunger strikes, protest marches. She takes those ideas, she brings them back to the United States and begins using those ideas here. So they did protest marches, hunger strikes, and they actually even protested in front of the White House. Okay, this is embarrassing for President Wilson. Having these women protesting out in front of the White House was pretty embarrassing. They got arrested, they threw them in jail, they force-fed them, so they had a pretty rough time. And all of that was put into the newspapers. So these nice middle-class girls were going on hunger strikes, and it was put in the newspapers. Didn't look very good for the government to say, no, they can't, they only want the right to vote, but we're not going to give it to them. And these women are starving themselves and doing time in jail. So it didn't really look too good. So Alice Paul was a pretty smart lady. The 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. And women finally got the right to vote after 72 years. Women were also interested in other types of social reform. So they would do things like volunteer to staff libraries, they raised money for charity, they sponsored laws to require safe workplaces, and actually formed their own trade union in 1903. So they encouraged women to form unions, they raised money to help striking workers, especially other women who were on strike, and they bailed out women who were thrown in jail because of strikes. Because back in those days, if you got thrown in jail, if somebody didn't bail you out, you stayed there. And many of these women who were on strike lost their jobs. If you went on strike, a lot of times you were blacklisted and you weren't allowed to go back to work. This is my favorite picture of all time. Okay, women were also interested in the Temperance Crusade, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the Anti-Saloon League led the drive for prohibition of alcohol. This lady is Carrie Nation. You may recognize her. Love her. She used an axe to actually break into saloons. She broke liquor bottles, and she was always in the newspaper for something. This was my favorite picture of her because she's got her hatchet in one hand her Bible in the other, and I like the purse that she has, because if you're gonna break bottles in the saloon, you obviously need to have your purse with you. I think that's really important.
Don't mess with her.
Don't mess with her. She got a lot of attention doing this, a lot of publicity. And that was it for that. So let me just see if I can, any questions on that? I know I flew through that fast. I'm at 10 minutes, okay. Okay, so let me
But
see.
how much earlier did the